This is week 9 of Research Methods 1, and today's lecture is going to take us towards the end of the term. Again, just as a reminder, we do not have a separate finals week this term, so week 10 and finals week are combined. So we have a lot to get done in the next couple of weeks. So getting started. All right, I just want to, as we move towards your final proposal writing project, I wanted to do a little bit of review to just kind of bring things full circle to help you focus in on what it is we're trying to accomplish. So we started out by talking about scientific research and about how the need to be objective and how we go about this, and that there are some key characteristics that we need to incorporate as we embark on our research. And one is to do so with purpose and not with any frivolous means, right? And to ensure that we have rigor so that we're basing our research on sound theory and method, that we can actually test it in an appropriate manner and possibly replicate the study as well to continue to use the method and to validate our results in other venues, other times, other circumstances, or similar circumstances. And then really zero in on precision and confidence of our research and our findings to ensure that we are accurate and that our estimates are correct. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about objectivity versus bias and subjectivity, so that's really, really important. And then the concept of generalizability. If you are doing a research project within a specific company or department for purposes of its use only, then typically that is not generalizable to the rest of either the industry or other similar companies. But if you create a research project that can do both, then that has even greater impact on the processes and performance of companies and industry. Parsimony, we hope that our, regardless of how we pronounce it, that the idea is to be as simplistic as possible. In other words, we don't want to overcomplicate things. We want to get rid of all the noise, and we want to zero in and focus in on exactly what needs to be done and do it succinctly. We utilize the scientific method, and we won't go all the way through it because we aren't actually conducting research in this particular course, but you will in the future probably. So we start with our hypothesis. So we have a curiosity or a question, and after reviewing the body of knowledge out there, we're able to make a strong assumption which we develop into a hypothesis. And then we have to be able to figure out a way to take that hypothesis and make it and put it into a form where we can actually measure it, and that's called operationalizing. So in other words, you take a characteristic or trait or emotion or outcome that may not be easily measured by itself, but we put it in terms that can be measured. And then we also move on then to the actual measurement itself. How are we going to do that? The process involved. We looked at a variety of things, including participants, sampling, etc. And once we have gathered our data, we need then to evaluate and try to report it out, and then work on a concluding remarks section in which we talk about the impact, what it means to either a specific company or industry or general management or perhaps manufacturing. It depends on your audience. And So at the end, we are hoping to eventually that others will replicate and possibly revise and report again on. So this is a visual representation of what we call the research wheel. I introduced this in an earlier week, so it's not new, but it gives you an idea that at the very top, we're starting with either theory or best practices, literature, what body of knowledge that's out there that exists. And we need to understand that and then look for gaps in that, or gaps that don't explain the phenomenon or the problem that we're trying to solve. And from there, we form our research question or hypothesis and move into our observation or data collection, etc. So you can see how the wheel continues to function. In terms of designing our research, so we need to look at designing a method to collect the data that will actually answer the question that we're seeking to answer or test our hypotheses. And so we want to do it as efficiently as possible. We don't want to, again, have it be cluttered or have too much noise there. So first of all, we want to make sure that we're focused in on it, but some practical reasons for doing that is that we don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time, effort, or money. And I apologize, by the way, for the typo on the screen for time. I'll fix that. And we want to make sure that our design is as bias-free as possible. So objectivity, objectivity, objectivity. And then that it could result in producing useful data. So those are really important aspects of our method design. Then we need to determine who our participants are. And we start by looking at the overall large population and then figuring out how we're going to sample or test pieces of that population if we can't if it's not, if we're not capable of testing the entire population or it isn't prudent to do so. So we have to select, and then we have to prepare our participants for participation. Make sure they understand confidentiality, anonymity, the ethics behind it, the purpose behind the study, and what this means to them and to the researcher and to the body of knowledge. I have loaded a link here that I would really love for you to watch. It's called the Hawthorne Studies. You've probably heard of it in both management class, for sure, and probably organizational behavior class, if you've taken that. So many years ago at the Hawthorne plant, Western Electric decided to perform a study. They were interested in whether or not the intensity of light in their factory would have an effect on the outcome of performance of their various employees. And really summarizing this, it was a little more complex than that. And what they found, the bottom line was, the minute that they began observing workers with changing of lighting intensity, the workers changed their behaviors. And the takeaway for us in this is that the act of observing something can actually change it as well. So we have to think about these things when we build in into our method and our design as how we're going to collect our data. So the Hawthorne studies are really interesting. This is just a short clip of an overview, and it is an older film, so it's very authentic looking and should be quite interesting for you in terms of this particular course. Another barrier or issue that we need to make sure that we are avoiding is this self-fulfilling prophecy. Oftentimes, particularly when observers or researchers are observing behavior, they will often see what they want to see. And it's so important, again, to remain that objectivity, that we have to do everything we can to remove our bias as researchers and experimenters, okay? So I love this quote. It's from a different book. Data typically do not speak for themselves. Analyzing data is an interpretive process. So when we engage in that interpretive process, we want to be as objective as possible. Another thing another TED Talk, by the way, that's really interesting is by Hans Rosling. You may have probably heard of him. He wrote the book Factfulness, but he's been giving talks all over. He's been very active on social media. He's done more than one TED Talk. This one is sort of his introductory one, and you may have seen it in some of your other classes. But it is perfect for this course because he talks about how data can really is often used incorrectly and can be interpreted in different ways, and how to really boil down and really look at the world through objective, realistic realism perspective. So I will share this link as well in Canvas underneath this video. And if you're looking at PowerPoint, you'll see this is also a hot link as the others are. This is an amazing talk, so please do take a look at it. So in our process, we've come up with our question, our hypotheses, and part of that is determining what our variables are. So these are the concepts that we want to study. So we have two main types of variables, dependent and independent. So the dependent is a primary interest. This is the one that we're trying to really understand or explain behavior of. So then we add the independent variable or variables, and they actually influence the dependent variable in some manner. It can be positive or negative. It may not affect it at all. But so remember that the dependent variable is the concept or construct that we want to understand how it changes or alters, and we use independent variables to try to explain that. Okay. And from there, we're able to write our hypothesis, right? And again, we are looking for relationships. We can either be exploratory and try to figure it, because we don't know. We don't have a good assumption that we can make based on the body of knowledge out there and based on logical reasoning and common sense. We may or we may not. And sometimes it's an actual question instead of hypothesis that we may be trying to answer. But a hypothesis is something that we can actually test, okay? And that we use our variables to build those tests and to reflect on that, their relationship with one another. So obviously a good hypothesis needs to speak to the purpose or question that we're trying to answer or solve. We need to be able to test it, so it has to be testable, and it should be the best that we can possibly come up with. So you may write several different wordings of your hypothesis until you find that right one that just really zeroes in on what you're trying to do. And a hypothesis can either be directional or non-directional, so it could be that there is a positive relationship between two variables, meaning that if one goes up, the other goes up. Or there could be an inverse relationship where if one goes up, the other goes down. Or there could just be non-directional where there is a difference, right? There's a difference between these two variables acting on another variable. So we don't say whether it's positive or negative or bigger or smaller or whatever. We just say there's a difference. A null hypothesis, which was covered in your textbook, basically says that there is no relationship or difference between the independent and dependent variables. So in previous years, researchers were strongly encouraged to include a null hypothesis first, because if the null hypothesis demonstrates that there is no relationship, then we don't need to test all the others, right? But in more recent times, it's acceptable to include it or not include it. The alternative hypothesis is what we just talked about, where there is a difference in how the variables react with each other, and it can be directional or non-directional. So there are a couple of types of errors when we're looking at designing our method and collecting our data. One is a type 1 error, and this is where we actually find a difference that doesn't exist. Well, that's not good. And this is where we really need to look at significance level and probability. And we as researchers can set up those parameters and dial that in. Type 2 error is different. It's when you accept a null hypothesis. You accept that there is no difference when there actually is a difference. So that's not good either. And that can be improved by sample size. So it could be your sample size is too small. But one of the things you have to remember is if you go overboard on one of these, you can put the other one could get out of sync or out of kilter. So you have to kind of balance the two because they are somewhat related and can have an effect on each other. So you got to find that sweet spot, right? Then we also looked at validity. So we did some homework and read in our textbook about internal validity. And so we want to look at some of the changes that can occur for other reasons, not just our experiment or our study. So, and some of the examples we used in our homework or our discussions really made an effect on that. So you can see some of these are on the screen as well. Okay, so that brings us to our final presentation, which you're going to put together of your research proposal. So you'll start out with an introduction of the problem or question that you want addressed. You can see here some of the key points. And by the way, this is detailed in Canvas. I'm jumping ahead. This is doing week 10, but it's time to really get going on this. And then a brief overview of the theories involved, and hopefully you did your literature review on the topic that you want to write your proposal on. So you've got that a bit dialed in already. And you're just going to boil it down to the key ones because it's a presentation, it's not a book, right? And then as you do that, that will bring to light the variables and the following hypothesis or research question that you're going to write your proposal on. And that then leads to the design and methodology of your study. So you're looking for gaps in existing processes or knowledge out there. In other words, you're not able to adequately answer your question or solve your problem by what's already existing out there, or you're not sure if it fits your particular problem. So those are the key areas as you move into the final design. So then you do need to tell us how you're defining your population of participants and what sampling methodology you're going to use, what's your strategy, and then what method you'll use to test or answer this, and what instrument you might use. Are you going to use a survey? Are you going to use observation? And how will are those pre-made? Will you write your own questions, etc.? Lastly, we usually list limitations in a study, and that might be it's limited only to my specific company, so it's not generalizable to others. It is limited in scope, in geography, in it's only addressed in manufacturing. We don't know if we can apply it over here to service industry, things like that. And that's a minor point, but if you see these, it would be good to point those out. And then your conclusion is to remind us of the importance of the study. So you're circling back to your opening and the reasoning behind the study design and kind of bringing it to a conclusion and what outcome you assume you are likely to find. And don't forget your references.